Hey everybody, I'm here with Morgan. Is it Aldous? Is that the way you say it?
All this. Yep,
All righty. Well, Morgan and I have been interacting online now for a few years, I think, probably a couple years,
probably.
and anyway, had a lot of backs and forth over the years, and so we finally decided to sit down and go face to face and talk a little bit about anarchism today. How you doing today, Morgan?
I'm doing well. Doing really well.
Good. Glad to have you on. So. Anyway, one of the big topics that you and I always talk about when we're online is about the subject of anarchism. It's been one of the themes that came up. You recently recommended that I take some books and read them on the subject, so I did. And I really actually enjoyed it. It was insightful. And I like to make sure I disagree with a lot of people online. And one thing is when people say that I don't understand. That's like a trigger to me. I'm like, no, I have to make sure that I understand. I don't want people to say that I don't understand what they're saying. We can disagree, but it's different if you don't understand. I don't want to attack a straw man argument. I want to make sure I understand. So if I do have a legitimate disagreement, we can do that. So anyway, thanks for recommending those books to me.
You bet.
So to get started,
Well, real quick,
go ahead. You ahead.
To those that are watching or listening or whatever, the books I recommended were "The Problem with Political Authority" by Michael Huemer, and that really just gets into, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, but that really gets into like the philosophy of anarchism, and it's a critique of the state philosophically, very academic. So if you want just like a really like good philosophical understanding, that's a book that I really highly recommend to people. Although I confess I haven't read it, but I am familiar with it. And then the other was The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman. David's father, Milton Friedman, is pretty well known in conservative circles. Kind of during the Reagan era, he was really popular. He showed up in a lot of television interviews and stuff, advocating for things like free markets and everything. So he was a free market, small government economist. His son went even further and became an anarchist. And so in that particular book, he kind of gives his rationale for anarchism as well as a vision of how a stateless society might work.
Perfect. And let's start with that. That's what I actually want to just actually hit on first is this definition, right?
Okay.
So anarchism, okay? Immediately, the misconception, the thing that people think, the thing that I thought is anarchists are people who are in the street painting anarchist signs on things and burning stuff. And that's what anarchists are about. And so anarchism is chaosism. And that's what anarchists are all about. And I was wrong. You want to explain a little bit why I was wrong?
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to understand why people have that misconception. I had that misconception at one time. It's easy to do because, the punks that are out doing that kind of stuff, they do use anarchist iconography and everything. But the definition that I really like comes from Murray Rothbard. He was a big advocate of anarchism. He was a PhD economist. He taught at UNLV for a long time and is he's a big name in the libertarian world. In a lot of ways, he's kind of the father of modern libertarianism. But anyway, so his definition goes something like, he defines anarchy or anarchism as a system in which there is no legal opportunity for someone to initiate violence against a peaceful person. And I think that's a really good definition that really pretty well describes what I mean when I say I'm an anarchist. It's for one thing, and this will confuse a lot of people, I think, but anarchists are not against government. We're not anti-government. We're against the state as a provider of government.
And that's something that I want to differentiate or let you differentiate. What is that difference between the state and government?
Yeah. So I think that a good definition of government is the mechanism in a society to administer justice.
Okay.
And the definition of the state, there's a few definitions The one that I like the most and that I think is the most useful and the most applicable and the most true was developed by the sociologist Max Weber. If you've ever taken a sociology class, you know Max Weber. He's one of the fathers of sociology. But in 1918, he came up with a definition of the state, which is the organization that claims a monopoly on the legal use of violence in a given area, or legal right to initiate violence in a given geographical area. And I've heard some arguments against that, but whenever somebody tells me that's not the definition of the state, I say, okay, tell me the name of a state that doesn't fit that definition, and they never can. And tell me an organization that fits that definition that isn't a state, and they never can. So
Yeah.
to me,
Now,
attacking at both sides, I think that's a good definition.
and that's something that also, I guess, maybe before we even, because I want to look at the political spectrum a little bit, talk about where anarchism fits on that. But this idea of the state as an agent of violence, essentially, who has a monopoly on violence in a particular geographical region. So for me, just to kind of my perspective as I've looked at this, is I've always thought, okay, what does the state do? What is the essential role of the state? Well, they create legislation, okay? And these laws or legislation are all kind of, and I know some of these are technical terms, but I like to kind of dumb it down. It's like they create the rules, okay, for people in a given area. And they say, look, we make the rules in this given area, and if you break the rules, we have guys with guns who will make you follow the rules, or else they will hurt you or lock you in a cage for a long time, okay? And when you really break it down, that's what every law is. A law that, and I'm talking in the legal sense as legislation, the rules that are created by the state are ultimately, they're things that we wouldn't do regularly. Because if I would do it on my own, you don't need to have a law because I'm already doing that. Like if I was just voluntarily giving a crap ton of money to the government every month, then you wouldn't have to have taxation laws, right? So when you really boil it down, and this is kind of where I got to, I was like, you're right. And it all comes down to that all the government, all the state, well, I guess we'll talk the state is it's an agent of force. It's to coerce people to do certain things. Now, the argument is, and my justification, or some people is that, well, but there are bad people out there that you want to use violence against because they are out hurting people, and so we need someone to go and respond to that.
But that's not initiation.
Yes.
If they are initiating, if someone else is initiating violence, then the general idea is that you have a right to respond to it. But only the government can initiate violence.
Yes.
If my neighbor's minding his own business, mowing his lawn, and I decide he owes me $100, and I go over and hit him with a club and take the money, I can't do that as a private citizen. The state does it every April 15th or whatever.
Yep. You're here. You got to pay your dues. And I think we can get into some of the justifications that people give for that, because I think that they're worth considering. But although I do think that philosophically they fail, I think Humer does a good job of that in his book. Now, one thing that I want to I'm going to pull something up here on the screen for everyone. We may disappear off the screen. Actually, no, I don't think we did have to. There we go. All right. So I've been trying to think of a good political compass, and there's a bunch of them out there, and people have different ideas. I've thought of this one. This is the one that I recently have been thinking about, and it's this idea of, okay, there's two main concerns when we're thinking about organizing our society. One is just our outlook on the way things should be, right? What is right? What is wrong? Okay. I may think that it's wrong for someone to steal, or I may think that it's wrong for someone to cheat on their wife or whatever. Okay. And so there's different types of ethics out there. And generally, if we were to kind of just try and polarize them into two different ideas about ethics, there are things that are more traditional ethics, and this can vary from culture to culture. And generally, we would refer to people who have more traditional ethical views as right wing. Okay, I think that's kind of and again, this is how people, I think, conceptualize ethics on an ethical thing. Right is more traditional. Left tends to be more novel. It's more modern, more cosmopolitan in its ethical ideas and philosophies. So that's the question of what should be done as far as like what is right and what is wrong. But then there is, okay, but how does the state factor into that? Right. And that's where I created this vertical axis. Right. And we're basically talking about the initiation of violence. Like how much power should we give to the state to enforce what we think is right or wrong? Okay. And so this is sort of your axis of what I call political philosophy, and the horizontal axis is the axis of ethical philosophy. And in this particular conversation, when we're talking about anarchism, we are talking about a political philosophy. We are not necessarily talking about an ethical philosophy. Just because I don't believe that the state, or just because I believe that adultery is wrong, does not mean I believe that the state should go find an adulterer, bring him and throw him in a cage for the rest of his life for cheating on his wife, right? That would be the very authoritarian view of the state, where the libertarian, or if you go to the farthest end of this, you may even call it anarchist, is no, that the state should not be involved in that at all. First, I just wanted to get your thoughts on this sort of conception. What are your thoughts on conceptualizing a political compass in this way? And if this isn't your conception, how would you conceptualize it?
It's interesting, and I think that it's a good exercise. I'm perennially frustrated with political compasses and spectrums. It's natural as humans to want to do something like that. We like to be able to put things on spectrums and axes and boxes and all of that. But not everything does fit in those,
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about the political spectrum, I generally stick to the original from the French Revolution. A lot of people don't know that that's where our political spectrum comes from.
Okay.
So in revolutionary France and in the aftermath, the House, their representative government, their legislative assembly, ended up being divided into two general camps. And so on the right side of the room sat the monarchists that wanted to restore the monarchy, restore the House of Bourbon,
Mm-hmm.
and people who had an interest in restoring the Catholic Church's place in French society.
Mm-hmm.
Because before the Revolution, the Catholic Church actually held a very particular social stratum. It was the royalty and nobility, the clergy, and then everybody else. That was kind of the layout.
Uh-huh.
And so the people on the right wanted to restore that and bring back that original system.
To conserve it.
The people on the left,
conservatives.
exactly. That's why we call them conservatives. The people on the left wanted to do away with that. And so the left actually was further broken into two camps. There were the socialists that, they need no introduction. They were collectivist and they wanted, collective perceptions of property and all of that. And then there were the liberals, which the most famous liberal in the French Assembly is Frédéric Bastiat, who he wrote a lot. His most famous work is a little pamphlet he wrote called The Law, which is his anti-socialist pamphlet. Ezra Taft Benson loved Frédéric Bastiat. He actually quoted him in General Conference. Ron Paul is always telling people to read Frédéric Bastiat. He's a really brilliant thinker. Mm-hmm. And so eventually the word liberal got corrupted, and now we had to make up a new term, libertarian, which frustrates people in Europe because the word libertarian there, since 1857, has referred to a certain kind of socialist anarchist. And then here in America, we have these right-wing proprietarians that want to use the term. And So it becomes a big mess. But
And that's
the
and that.
original,
Oh, go ahead.
so the original political spectrum, though, that's what it was. It was people who wanted to maintain the monarchy and the Catholic Church on the right, and the people who wanted to overthrow the system on the left. Some of them were collectivists, some of them were the liberals, the libertarians, the individualists.
I
And
see.
so that's the spectrum. That's what it originally meant. And that's really as useful as it gets. I think the further you stray from that, the less useful it gets. So,
And
with
do
that in
you?
mind, I am a proud liberal and I am a proud leftist.
All right. So proud leftist, proud liberal, and it's funny because I've often told people one of the challenges we have in America is that I consider myself a conservative, but what I'm trying to conserve is the American Revolution, which was a liberal. It was the anti-monarchists in
Mm-hmm.
that we were part of. So you're
Mm-hmm.
conserving a anyway, the terminology gets all messy, and I agree with you. I think
It
that's
does.
one of the things that confuses the political discussion, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and Europeans hate
Yeah,
American terminology for that because we use terms that they have used for 200 years, and we use them in totally the opposite ways that they use them, and it drives them nuts.
yeah, I can see that. So getting back to that, so one question on terminology in relation to anarchism. How do you differentiate a libertarian and an anarchist? I mean, what's kind of the line there?
Um, so this is in American usage. Libertarian is a blanket term with two broad divisions. The one side is what we would call a minarchist. So archos is the Greek for ruler, and min, like minimum, as little as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are people like Randy and objectivists are usually minarchists. There's this concept called the night watchman state, which is where you have a state that provides police and courts, and that's it. They don't legislate. They simply are there to punish people who violate rights and force them to give restitution. Um, and so that's the minarchists. And then the anarchists are the ones who say, well, even that's too much. Policing and courts are mostly invalid, and where they are valid, they can be provided by other means. We don't need a single organization that has a monopoly on violence.
Good. Yeah. No. And that okay. So that's kind of what I thought. And so let's talk.
Both libertarians.
And so those are and that's kind of the way. But both are libertarians. They just are different flavors of the libertarian kind of ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about the state and the problems with it. So a lot of people are like, okay, so let's first take a look at where we've kind of talked about. So the state is an instrument that is allowed to initiate violence, and sometimes we may think that well, I guess in your definition, as you had said it, that's never really justified because the state should only be responding to the initiation of violence rather than going out and initiating that violence. And so people who, and the thing is, well, I guess I would ask, in your mind, why is the state illegitimate in that sense? Why can't the state go out and begin to enforce taxation laws or different things like that? What is the problem, the essential problem with the state? How would you sum that up?
I'll answer that question with another question.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't I do that?
Because I'm going to give the devil's advocate answer because I'm more on your side than not, but I'll give the answer as I see it. So most people would say, well, the state represents us as a group of people, and we as a group, as any group, has the authority to create the rules by which we're all going to interact with one another so it isn't chaos. And And so therefore, that is the institution that we have granted that authority to.
Where did I get that authority and able to grant it to them?
By being in the, being part of the society. By being part of the society, you are...
So I do have the right to initiate violence. I must have it in order to delegate it.
You have the right to, well, I guess then maybe the argument could be made this way, because I think that is a very, very difficult point to argue, okay, from someone who believes that the state can go and initiate violence against people who have not done anything wrong, right? I think everyone should be able to, even if they don't in practice, should be able to at least philosophically agree to the premise and the axiom that no one should be out initiating violence on innocent people. The question is, do you have the authority to respond to violence committed by other people, let's say kind of more from a minarchist perspectives, where it's the state won't initiate violence, but it will respond to people violating the rights of other people?
Well, then it's not a state.
So you'd say that that's not a state because...
And that's the problem with minarchism, is it can't actually exist because either competition will pop up, market competition will pop up, and there will be other options to have your rights violations taken care of. And then you have anarchism. You now have polycentric law, as David Friedman calls it. Mm-hmm. And you have market-based law. So the minarchy will either turn into anarchism because it gets competition, or it will take on extra rights to stomp out competition and is no longer a minarchy. It's now a legislative body.
So what you're saying is that minarchism won't work simply because it will have to monopolize the initiation of violence in order to exist. And if it does that, if it's forced to initiate violence, well, then it's a state. It's not with all the problems that come with a state. But is there an argument to be made that, all right, well then the minarchist society creates a state, but that state is truly limited in its scope and its power. And we create a constitution to limit it, and we create all these checks and balances. Isn't that sort of the American system of government? Was a minarchist system that kind of turned into a state, but with minimum power as possible?
I would say that the American system was never minarchist because it had a legislative body in it.
Okay.
And that's old. People say that the Constitution is like this great beholder of free, someone has never read the Constitution when they think that's what it is. Like, the average American seems to think that the Constitution is this like treatise about liberty, but it's not. It's a handbook for political theater to legitimize ongoing legislation. That's literally all the Constitution is. It is not anything else. And as long as you have ongoing legislation, you have a growing state. The Constitution does not limit government. It's a handbook for continually expanding government, and that's all it's ever been.
I will say that I think that there is a valid critique to be offered of the Constitution, of the fact that the trend of government since, the beginning of the Constitution has been the expansion of the state and state power. There's no doubt that has happened. I think we could go into a lot on that subject, and I want to come back to sort of anarchism in particular, with regards to the curious out there who are wondering, okay, all right, so the state is out there, they initiate violence, but I want to go into how laws would work, because people are going, all right, well, what happens if you don't have a state? Like, who do I call if somebody steals my stuff? There's no police. It'd be chaos, right? Everyone would just kill each other. Like, how is it that the state could that we could live in a stateless society? And we'll just start, and I guess we'll kind of go through a few different ones. But the first one is, I'll just start with a scenario of someone steals my car. Like, what do I do? Do I just go and shoot the guy who took my car?
You can try, but you're probably not going to get very far. You're not going to be respected in society if you do that. So one example is a couple weeks ago, I was in a car wreck that was my fault, totally my fault. And so I called my insurance company. My victim called their insurance company. Our insurance companies talked. They got the money they needed to fix their car. I got the money I needed to fix my car. No state needed. And so insurance offers a pretty good model for the ways in which you can maintain your property and personal rights. Is that absent the state, we would probably see insurance companies that offer security insurance, and they would be the ones responsible. That's the question of who you call. Somebody's breaking into your house, you call your insurance company, they say, great, we'll send over our, it's just like calling roadside assistance when your car breaks down.
Except for they show up with machine guns and body armor.
Well, they might, hopefully not. That's one of, the state does that, but that's because they can. When you have a market operating system, you're going to end up with better ways to take care of it. There's a really great example of this. It's called the Detroit Threat Management Center. So Detroit is, notoriously bad. It's rotting from the inside because of the collapse of the automotive industry there and everything else. It's well known to be a hotbed of violence and corruption and all of that. And so there's a neighborhood in Detroit that the cops wouldn't even go to anymore. And so what emerged was this private company called the Detroit Threat Management Center. And this is like it's a low income residential area. And so they went around to all of these apartment buildings and said, hey, for this fee, we will secure your residence. And they were like, great, sounds good. And once this happened and people started feeling secure, they found that the rents started being paid more. People that are secure pay rent. That's the lesson that they learned. And so it was mutually beneficial. The landlords were making more profit. This company was providing security and was profitable. And they got rid of all the drug dealers. It's actually pretty funny how they got rid of the drug dealers. There was this one corner that it was one of the properties that they were contracted with that was notorious for drug dealers, and the landlords wanted them gone. And so they had one of their guys go out and pose as a dealer. And he was out pretending to sell drugs. And this company, they rolled up with a van. They had a bunch of guys come out with rubber clubs and say, hey, no dealers on this corner. And they beat this guy, made it look like they were beating the crap out of him. They threw him in the back of the van and they drove off. And there has not been a drug dealer on that corner in 25 years. And so it's been very effective. That part of Detroit has really cleaned up. It's doing a lot better than it was 30 years ago when they started. But they understand that they are not the state. They know that when they put on their uniform, they have the exact same rights as they do when they're not wearing the uniform, which is that they do not have the right to initiate violence. They only have the right to self-defense and to defend others. And so that's the way they act. And in 30 years, they've cleaned up this neighborhood. They've never actually hurt anybody. Their training is focused on de-escalation. And that's the way they operate. And it's been hugely successful. And so that to me is a great case study for what we're talking about, is that in a world absent the state, which this neighborhood essentially was, you will have market-based security pop up that is affordable for the residents because they're not paying for it directly. Their landlords are, and the businesses that want to be secured are. So the people are being protected more or less for free. It's included in their rent, I guess you could say. They're making a profit doing it, and they have a market incentive to be as peaceful as possible and to maintain other people's rights and not take new rights unto themselves like state police do. You know, they don't have qualified immunity. They don't have any of these things. They're not police. They're just people.
And they're able to provide the security, because ultimately what the government is doing is that the state is doing is that it's providing you with particular services. And from what I can tell from the anarchist perspective is that just break down those services and they can be privatized. One that was interesting to me is, go ahead.
That's, to put it in a nutshell, is everything the state does that is valid can be done by anyone. Anything they do that's invalid shouldn't be done by anyone. And so that's kind of the anarchist vision.
So, and going back again to the idea of the initiation of violence, the idea is that no one is authorized to initiate violence, only to respond to it. And therefore, like you said, if you have the right to do that, then why not have a private entity that can do that? Now, I'll bring up a scenario because the people that are listening might have this question, is the idea of, okay, well, what happens if I hire my security firm and I'm like, come and try and take your, I got my boys are here and I have, maybe I got my own security company. Maybe I own a security company and all these people work for me. And it's like, dude, I got boys. You come and try and get your stuff back. Like, I dare you. Right? So how do you prevent because one problem with the anarchist view or potential critique that someone could offer is the idea that all you're going to end up with is a gang warfare system where everyone has their own gang that we call a private security company, and they're going to protect their customers, and the other one's going to protect theirs, and then violence is going to break out. And I know that these are addressed in the books, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So what that comes down to is these are companies. I think it was Milton Friedman who said, a private company's social responsibility is to make a profit. War itself is not profitable. War is only profitable if you have taxation power. And so the incentive of these insurance companies is to work together, not to go to war with each other. They're not going to waste a bunch of resources in destruction. The incentive just isn't there, especially because once it becomes known that these two firms are going to war with each other, they're going to lose all their customers and their money's going to dry up. They're not going to risk losing all of their customers with the bad PR of protecting one through street warfare. And in a privatized society, what's going to happen is their private sewer provider is going to cut off service to their headquarters. Their private electricity provider is going to cut off electricity to their headquarters. Their private bank is going to say, I'm not supporting that. And they're going to freeze their account.
So you're saying those private institutions would have the ability to essentially self-regulate through essentially like, we're not going to do business with your company because you guys are a bad company. And so you literally, like, we could, through a boycott, shut them totally down if they are a big enough nuisance to the society. Is that kind of the way that it would work? Yeah, no, and I definitely can see how that can work. Now, some might, in our current culture, take issue with that. It's like, well, wait a minute, that's like cancel culture, right? Like, if you don't go along with what everyone wants, they're just going to shut you down. What are your thoughts there?
Anybody who gets upset at that or is surprised by that has never tried to run a business.
And ultimately, it's kind of like you have to operate within the society that you're in and play nice with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I do have some more thoughts
That's
on. Oh, go ahead.
just, to kind of give an example, years and years ago, I started my own little lawn care business.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this will be great. Like I'll be my own boss. I'll have no boss. I can just like make money. But what you learn quickly when you start a business is that every customer becomes your boss.
It's funny.
And
I literally just yesterday was telling someone everybody has a boss. The difference is, do you have one boss or do you have a whole bunch? And if you have a whole bunch of bosses, you make a lot more money.
yep.
But it's a lot harder work.
Yeah, exactly. And so, when you're the state, you are the boss. And you can get away with a whole lot more. When you are a private company providing a service like security, you have a ton of bosses, your customers. And it's just not profitable to do what the state does in a market situation.
Yeah. And I understand that. And now I have some things that I want to go in on that, but I don't want to bog us down in that. And maybe we can talk about it at another point. But I want to go into another aspect of it, right? So we talked about law enforcement, but what about the law itself? It's like, well, wait a minute. Like, how are laws determined or created? That's a question that a lot of people have, like courts, for instance. How does a system of law and order, and not just, hey, I got my security company, you got yours, we're all going to fight each other, like, how do disputes get resolved within an anarchist system?
Yeah. So there's this in England for a long time, they had, there's kind of this idea that like they were a monarchy and the king made decrees and was an absolute ruler. That's never how it's worked. Like,
yeah, it's not.
Absolute monarchy is actually a very modern idea. Like 1700s is when that idea came up.
Yeah.
Power was always very highly distributed, even in the Middle Ages. And so in England for a long time, they had a system of common law, which is the legislative idea of law is that law is made by authorities. The common law idea is that law is discovered through trial. And that's why we call court proceedings trials. You're trying things out. You're finding out what the law is. You're hearing both sides and trying to build this framework. And over time, what you end up with is laws. It's called case law, or the body of law. And so
meaning the rulings that have come, it's like a guy stole and they put him in jail for 2 days. Another guy came, he stole, so they put him in jail for 3 days. And it's kind of like over time, it's like, all right, now we know that the way this is going to go is if I steal something, I'm going to end up in jail for 3 days if I don't have the money to pay it back, or whatever they decide collectively, these judges, these wise people in the society. Mm-hmm. And so is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah. It's just this idea that over time, through all of these cases and everything, you start to discover, it's a sense of discover. You're discovering what the law is. And that comes through this trial and error, and like, ooh, that, we punish that really harshly. And even a lot of like people were like, oh, I don't know about that. And so that's one kind of the main way that you hear a lot of libertarian theorists come out, is that it would be a system of common law where you have, these different protection companies and everything negotiating. And over time, just like over time, we discover what the price of milk is, because we have all of these different providers and all these different consumers and all these different distributors, and they're all trying different prices. And eventually, the supply and demand, if you know basic economics, the supply and demand curve, where they cross, that's your price. And it moves a little bit, but over
it's fairly steady.
It is fairly steady, unless something major happens on the supply end or the demand end or whatever.
Which is interesting because in law, you could potentially have that with some sort of an ideological movement could change what people think is just
It could.
according to the norms of the society. But that's going to happen regardless. That's just the way that any system of law will end up working, is it will follow whoever it is that makes the law. And in this case, essentially, judges would make the law. Or the way that I heard it, at least in the books that you had recommended, is this idea of arbitration firms. You and I have a dispute. I'm actually in a court proceeding right now with some lady who thinks that we owe her money. And anyway, it's a big load of garbage. But and it's a big pain because of the state. I'm telling you, it's like it's costly. It's garbage. We should go to an arbitrator, and then that arbitrator, we would agree upon an arbitrator. We say, look, we're going to go to this guy. We both agree that this guy is good, and then we would go to the arbitrator. We'd make our cases, and the arbitrator would settle it. Because and that sort of idea is whatever we think the arbitrators are going to do, because the arbitrators want to have a good reputation for fairness, so they can get more customers to come to them for arbitration. They would then those arbitrators would essentially develop a body of law, because in the end, what the law really is how is the judge going to rule? What is the decision of the case? You know what I mean? And obviously, then in the book, it talked about this idea of private contract, or the security firms would work with the arbitrator to say, all right, well, if they ruled that way and the guy still refuses, well, then you can send your, the people from the security company to go and collect the item. We do that essentially in, in repossession cases, or private firms that go and do that.
And that's what I wish people understood, is nothing the anarchists propose is novel. Like, all of these solutions have already been practiced. You mentioned arbitration. That is already huge. Like,
yeah,
a lot of companies and stuff, they don't even deal with the courts anymore. It's too expensive. It's too costly. It's too time consuming. So they work out contracts. They have their arbitrators, and it works out. And it already works. And people, when they have a choice to choose it, they do.
We're currently looking at arbitration in the case that I'm currently working on with this lady that's a crazy person. So anyway.
Yeah, so firsthand.
And I'm pretty confident the arbitrator is going to give us a fair shake, because we have a pretty good case. But, all right. One other aspect to it that people, I think a lot about, I know I have, as I've considered these ideas, and that is the idea of kind of like national defense. The other thing is, we live in a world that has states, lots of them, and some of them are very powerful and have powerful militaries. And there's sort of this idea, well, how could we, wouldn't these larger states be able to just go in and absorb a developing anarchist society and just kind of take them over and be like, well, guess what? We're here now. We got the guns. We're imposing our monopoly of force on you. And then people go, well, how do we get an army sufficient enough to defend against this sort of thing, or a military that can protect us? Because people have the idea that the state is best equipped to provide a military. What would you say to that?
I would say that that's very clever propaganda. So yeah, and this is an argument you have a lot, especially with people that support the idea of the state. The anarchist favorite pejorative is to call someone a statist. And so statists will say, oh, but if we had an anarchist society, what would stop another state from just taking us over, and then we'd have a state again? And then I like to look at them and say, well, then you'll be happy. Like, that's what you want. So I don't see how it's so funny when you talk to statists about anarchism, because the absolute worst thing that they can see coming out of anarchism is a return of the state. So if the state itself is the worst thing that can happen in an anarchist society, what does that say about the state?
That's just a little mental exercise for people to have. But yeah, it is a good question. And one way that I like to look at this is to look at the difference between Switzerland and France in World War II.
So in France, they had a highly centralized military, and they were conquered very quickly by the Nazis.
I can't remember the exact time, but I mean, it was like record time. The Nazis were marching into Paris, and there was a surrender. In an anarchist society, there's no one to surrender. When the French government and their generals got together and said, "Okay, we're done," then it's sorry, all you French citizens, you're now Nazi Germans. Sorry, you just are. We surrendered, and now you're that. Switzerland is not as cut and dry as the French example. I wish it was, but the Nazis never even tried to invade Switzerland. And Switzerland, there's several reasons for that. One is just that Switzerland had been respected as a neutral territory since like the 1840s or whatever, when they made that decision. Mm-hmm. Several of Hitler's advisors wanted to get into Switzerland, and Hitler actually said, "I will not be remembered as the butcher of the Swiss." And so, even someone as cold-hearted as Hitler has like this moral idea that it would be wrong to attack a neutral society. So that's one thing. The second is that Switzerland, a lot of people don't know this, Switzerland is actually highly decentralized, even more decentralized than the United States. It's separated into these autonomous regions called cantons. And they have like 9 presidents and no one knows who it is, and they like take public transportation. Like the Swiss equivalent of the federal government is very weak and very just like Nassim Taleb, is that the guy? Have you read
yeah, I know
his famous book
Anti-Fragile?
Anti-Fragile?
Oh, Anti-Fragile, yeah.
Yeah, that was another book of his. But Anti-Fragile, he's obsessed with the Swiss. He thinks that the Swiss system is like the perfect example of anti-fragility because it's so decentralized. And like he gives an example in Anti-Fragile about the Swiss. It's something like, nobody knows who the president is, but at the local level, there's like riots about where the drinking fountain's going to be installed. Just like everything is so localized there.
Yeah.
And so it's a highly decentralized area. A lot of people don't know this too. All the bridges in Switzerland are packed with explosives.
I didn't know
so that. Yeah, and they've actually over the last like 10 years they've started to remove it just because we live in a much more peaceful time now. But there was even a bridge that was built like as recently as like 20 years ago, and as they were building it, they were loading it with explosives. And so like Switzerland, if they were ever attacked, boom, they would just like their whole border would explode.
Well, and along those lines, one of the things too to kind of reinforce that point is, I always thought a good example is this idea of an insurgency. Because like you said with France, they go in, they knock out the standing army, and they say, all right, well, we're done. Whereas the real way to fight a war is to have everyone in your population armed and be like, yeah, we're all kind of going to fight, but we're going to act like we're your friends, and we're going to kill you in the night, and then we're going to plant some roadside bombs, and you're really not going to like being here. And what's funny is that people always point out like, oh, what are you guys going to do with your guns against the government? They have tanks. I'm like, yeah, you see what happened to us in Afghanistan? Like, we were there for like 20 years, and the Russians were there before that, and a bunch of goat herders with AK-47s and old broke-down Russian grenades, like, have been able to stop the most powerful militaries in the force, not by confronting and destroying them, but by grinding them down over time. Nobody wants to be in a place where you're just going to be ground to powder over long periods of time. And the same thing happened in Vietnam with the Viet Cong, a bunch of rice farmers out there. And so I've always been like that, and I always use that against the anti-Second Amendment people, is kind of like, you guys don't realize that the largest fighting force on Earth by like a factor of 100 is the American citizenry. Like, good luck, U.S. government or anybody else fighting an insurgency if there's enough of us who are pissed off. And I've kind of, and that I think was the argument within Humer's book that I think kind of helped get to me in the sense that that's feasible. That isn't as crazy of an idea as you might think, and large groups of people can band together for common cause if they believe in their anarchism and their free society. I think you anarchists just need to rebrand, man. You guys got to find a new word. I think that's half your battle.
There is. One of the popular terms that anarchists, particularly of this persuasion, because that's another whole thing we could get into, is there's a lot of ways to not have a state, and none of us agree.
Yeah.
But this more like American libertarian brand that's, based on property and free markets and everything. Another term that people like to use is voluntarism. They feel it's more descriptive. It doesn't come with the baggage of the word anarchist. But I do have to say, because I know we'll get a lot of comments that people are like, well, you didn't tell the full story about Switzerland and the Nazis. Another reason why the Nazis didn't attack Switzerland is because the Swiss were trading with them. And so that's another way to not be, and I have
you don't want to shoot your business partner.
Exactly. And so the idea is that if you have a broad cosmopolitan free trade system, you're going to have fewer enemies anyway. And, so while I would say that like highly immoral for the Swiss to be like building jets and bombs for the Nazis and the Nazis using that as one of many reasons why they didn't attack, it's like, I don't like that. But, that is another reality.
And I would say this, one of the things also that struck me in the books that as I read them was the idea of it isn't if the system is perfect. It's if the system is better than what we have currently. And like you kind of said, if the worst thing that can happen is that you're going to have a state, like, well, you're going to have a state, you know what I mean? And I think that's a valid critique. Now, with that said, I do think that there's a difference between the state of North Korea and, the state of the United States of America or Switzerland. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like we all have, there's different levels to it. Now, real quick, as we kind of get to wrap this up, I think we may talk a little bit more about some other things, but I wanted to kind of wrap up this first kind of half of this conversation. And that is from, you and I are both Latter-day Saints, and there's kind of how does this square with sort of an LDS conception of morality and the way things should be? I particularly find it interesting with kind of the LDS social conception is this notion of Zion as kind of this ideal society. Do you want to talk a little bit about the connections between sort of the vision of Zion and this notion of anarchism or a stateless society?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the Book of Mormon provides us with some really interesting ideas about anarchism. So like the reign of King Benjamin is really fascinating because he wasn't really a king in any way that we would identify it. At least if we're to believe his address, if we're to take his address at face value, when he's like, I don't tax you, I don't put you in prison, I don't live off of your labor, I work the fields and I maintain the law of Moses. And that's my job. And I try to be an example of righteousness to you. And that's how I see my job. Pretty cool.
That's basically what an American president is like, right?
Oh yeah, totally. I think Obama had a garden. So, he was basically King Benjamin, but,
any more mom jeans?
But we, as far as we can tell, King Benjamin wasn't legislating. He wasn't making edicts. It really seems like he was just a respected judge that people trusted and that he had integrity. And so people would bring their issues to him and he would deal with them justly. And that's the idea I get from the text anyway. I don't think it can be said conclusively, but based on the way he describes his reign in his grand address, it sounds very anarchist to me. And then, his son.
Go ahead.
Just, then you get his son who's like, this is working well for us now, but, if we ended up with like a King Noah, this wouldn't work. So we're going to make some changes. And he's like, we're going to have a system of judges. That's going to be better. And it's so funny. Like, the average Latter-day Saint takes Mosiah II's word on judges more than the actual record, because like it's so funny. Like, because you read Mosiah II's decree and his thing about kings and that they're bad if you get a bad one, and judges are better and there will be checks and balances, and that like really resonates with your Americanism. Like, you've gone through 12 years of public school, being taught that this is the greatest system in the world, and something about how the Constitution works, even though you seem to think that it's something that it isn't, as I mentioned earlier. And so, this really resonates with you, and you're like, yeah, this is it. This is the right way to do it. Like, yeah, the Nephites are being American. This is great. And then you turn the page and it's a disaster. Like, the reign of the judges is an unmitigated disaster. It's the most violent time in Nephite history. Like, it's so awful. And just like, it's way worse than things were under King Noah, which seemed to be Mosiah II's concern. Is like, ooh, what if we get another King Noah? Ooh, we'll have judges instead. And it ends up just being awful.
There's a lot of interesting political kind of intrigue within the Book of Mormon that I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with sort of political philosophy don't kind of see it or understand it. Are you, I don't know if you're familiar with Jeffrey Thain of ldsphilosopher.com or org, I'm not sure which.
Yeah, I've read some of his stuff.
Yeah, he wrote a few things on kind of LDS, kind of political drama within the Book of Mormon that I found interesting. And he has some ideas about sort of what could really be described almost as a minarchist type system, where it is a state that's based more just around judges and common law rather than actual legislative law. And I always thought those ideas were interesting. But the Book of Mormon has a lot of that. Now, one other thing that I think is very interesting is the idea of Zion. And I immediately noticed this connection. The idea of voluntarism is very much connected with our notions on agency, and the idea of everything having to be done by choice, and that your authority in the priesthood does not come from violence and force. It comes from long suffering, persuasion, basically voluntarism, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The idea of people voluntarily following you because you are someone who has the Spirit with them, that that they'll do that. And that was interesting to me, because then I realized if everything in Zion is voluntary, including consecration and all the rest of it, which is my belief. My belief is that that's what Zion is. It's a society where everyone takes care of each other, not because of state decree, but because of we love each other. Like, that's what you do. I take care of my kids because I love them, and I don't need a law to tell me to take care of my kids. And so that is what Zion is. That's the pinnacle of it, right? And then I thought, and it just occurred to me that that's a stateless society. And I was like, wait a minute. That means what I want as the ideal society is an anarchist society.
Exactly.
And it was interesting as I kind of, and don't get me wrong, I've always sort of understood this. In fact, ever since I was young, my dad said something to me. He gave me a quote, and I'm actually not sure if it's even a true quote, but it's a George Washington quote that's attributed to him that says, "This government is not eloquence, it is force." And when I was very young, that stuck with me. I understood. That's the fundamental thing that when I understood that, my entire perspective on the state changed. I said, wait a minute here. The state is about force. It's a guy with a gun. And so all political discussions, you have to remember, are a discussion about a guy with a gun. And I think one of the things I recently realized, so this, I wrote a couple blogs on this. I wrote a steel man of the social justice warrior position. The idea of power imbalances, we need to get the power and we need to use the power to make society good.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this, my critique of it, my attack on it, was based actually in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings,
Mm-hmm.
which is an entire thing about you take the ring of power and you throw it into the furnace. You get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't seek power, and that is how you win, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
that's I know you're like a huge fanboy of Captain Moroni, and that was one of his statements in one of his epistles to Chief Judge Pahoran. He said, "I seek not for power, but to pull it down." And yeah, I was actually, I'm glad you brought up Lord of the Rings, because I was going to, if you didn't.
awesome.
Tolkien understood this perfectly, and he called himself an anarchist. He actually wrote a letter.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. I'll find it for you. He wrote a letter to someone, I think it was his son. And he said, it's actually really funny because it ties in right with what you were saying earlier. To paraphrase this quote, he says, "I more and more identify as an anarchist, which is not people with whiskers and bombs in the streets, but the realization that no man is fit to rule another man, especially the one that wants to."
And that's very much the essence of his book, Lord of the Rings. I mean, what
Exactly.
is Gollum? Gollum is the creature that's possessed by this need for power and to have it, my precious, and it consumes him. And that, to me, that's what a social justice warrior is. They're people who crave the state, to have the power to make the world in their own image, the way that they want to by force. Right? Because
not
once
just
you have
social
the
justice
power,
warriors,
That's
even your precious American conservatives.
We'll talk a little bit about that. And actually, so on that note, I think we've had a pretty good conversation. We're getting about the time that I wanted to wrap things up. And I don't know how you're doing on time. If you want to continue and have a discussion, I would like to bring up some of maybe my concerns or some of my critiques and maybe why I'm not, or we can have that discussion another time. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we can do that another time. If I could just take a few more minutes of, there was another aspect,
and that's what I wanted to do. Give you the
you
kind of final time.
Yeah, because you'd kind of talked about, like, how do you square this with as a member of the church? And to me, it's very easy. Just like you said, like, it's Zion. That's what we're ultimately looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And it is difficult because, we do have all these statements from leadership and stuff that is adamantly statist. But I think that underlying it all, there is this anarchist thread. And, the classic thing that Christians love to throw at Christian anarchists is, and they think it's like the slam dunk, they always say, well, Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. And whenever I get that, I always get a little cocky with it. I always say, I dare you to say the rest of the sentence. Because they never do. They never say the second half. The second half is, and to God, the things that are God's.
Uh-huh.
So you have to remember, when Jesus was trolling the Pharisees, which is what was happening in this passage, he always has double meanings. And he's always offering a challenge to the Pharisees to see if they really are as faithful as they claim to be.
Uh-huh.
And so what's the subtext to a statement like that? He is setting up two powers, God and Caesar. Caesar, and there was a Latin term for this, and I can't remember what it was. It's something terra, which is world. And it's the idea that Caesar was the god of the world. And the Romans had this conception that Caesar owned everything. Well, God makes the same claim. It's his earth. He created it,
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, if you're going to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and render to God the things that are God's, the question you have to ask is, and the question Jesus didn't answer is, well, what does belong to Caesar and what does belong to God?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're a Latter-day Saint who has been through the temple, then you have covenanted to give everything that God has given you to God. So if you are a covenanted Latter-day Saint, nothing is Caesar's.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't, first of all, you can't fulfill both claims.
Yeah.
It's impossible. They both claim everything.
Well,
and
that is, I think that for me, as I've pondered, and actually, by the way, when you brought up the surrender unto Caesar, I think we actually had that discussion once, and it was actually one of the ones when I walked away going, it's a good point. I like that. I like that. That's a little deeper than I've gone on that one. And here's my feeling on it. I agree 100%. Your first loyalty is not to Caesar. And you might say not any loyalty to him, but I agree. I would say that, ultimately, that's one of the problems that we have is that people, and I've even seen it in my own family, where people will put the state as sort of their God. And they do. Mm-hmm. It does become
I pledge allegiance to the flag, and they do all their ordinances and rituals and covenants, and it's just disgusting. But anyway.
And so And again, when we have our discussions about that, I'll do it because I do still say the Pledge of Allegiance. But I'm not a fully converted anarchist yet. Maybe one day you'll get me, Morgan. But I'm going to offer my critique. But right now I'm in steelman mode, make sure I understand as much as I can. So one thing with that is, yes, it is the notion of ownership. Okay, the notion is that everything belongs to God. And that's one of the central issues in all of political kind of, thought. And one of the great problems of political philosophy is figuring out who owns what, right? And when everything belongs to God, nothing belongs to Caesar and nothing belongs to any of us. And our lives become totally dedicated to God. And again, that is a very anarchist, stateless sort of idea, right? Mm-hmm. And so, no, I think that's a great point. And you are definitely right to point out that Jesus liked to troll the Pharisees. And that was one of a lot of times people get the wrong idea of what Jesus was like, but he actually, he could troll with the best of them.
Yep. And that's one of the problems with taking Jesus's statements out of context. Because you can say like, well, Jesus said this. Well, yeah, as a troll to the Pharisees,
Yeah, you gotta. It's like the fake news media, man. They can spin any little statement you say. So anyway, I'll give you any other thoughts you have. Again, the purpose of this video was to hopefully give people at least a primer on this. Not looking to get everything in, but at least maybe pique some interest. Any other thoughts?
I'll give one last thing, which. One of the questions that people ask, sometimes people will say, okay, well, I grant you that maybe this is possible and maybe it would be good, but it's so different from what we have. So how do we get there? Mm-hmm. And that's an ongoing debate, whether we do it by political means or whatever. But one of my favorite things to do, one of my favorite conceptions of how we bring this to pass is a philosophy called agorism. And it comes from the Greek word for market, agora. Mm-hmm. And so the idea with agorism is that one way that I've heard it called is you minimize your government footprint. And that's an okay way to put it. But in a nutshell, agorism is the idea that you make the government obsolete by direct action, by providing the things that the government provides to your neighbors so that you have no need of it. And once you no longer need the things that are valid that it provides, then the facade falls and you see it for what it really is.
Yeah.
And so examples of this are cryptocurrency. That was actually one of the things that really kept me from embracing anarchism. Is I was like, what would we do about currency? Like, if everyone's allowed to make their own currency, what would we do? And that ended up being the first thing solved. Like, cryptocurrency, it does work. It is a valid system.
Yeah.
And so, when you use Bitcoin, you circumvent the Federal Reserve System, which is the taxation system as well. And we could get into that some other time. But so that's a great example. But my favorite example of agorism is what the church did in the 1930s. So, during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the state welfare system. And church leadership was horrified by this. They were like, this is not good. And so what they did, instead of lobbying the government and, protesting and sending representatives and everything else, they made a better welfare system.
Mm-hmm.
And
one that doesn't totally destroy families for generations.
Exactly. And that's agorism, it's like, I see your, and this is explicit. I'm not just saying like, oh, look what the church did and reading the minds of the
read the letter that the first presidency published introducing the welfare system. It specifically says that they created the church welfare system to keep the saints from, I believe the phrase they used was the evil dole. And that's
nice.
And so that's how we go about creating a stateless society, and that's how we go about creating Zion. Is we look after each other, so that we just don't need the state's services anymore.
Yeah. No, that's and as I read Humer's book, he talks about, how can we implement some of this stuff. And that particular idea I did find compelling. The phone company is one that's an example. I never lived where we had Ma Bell, but my parents talk about it. It was kind of this big deal when they're going to privatize the phone system. It was like, how can we ever do that? And now it's like you have an iPhone because of that. Like that's the level of service difference that can be there. So I've always been of the mindset of that privatizing things, almost always you get lower cost, better quality, and if there is a way to gradually make the state obsolete rather than some kind of a radical revolution or something, that definitely is more feasible. The challenge, and I think the challenge, as you well know, is I think is just people don't understand the philosophy. They don't understand the idea. They don't understand the vision of sort of this anarchic society or a society without the state. And as I've said, I have some thoughts on that on this, but I think more than anything I've come out of this annoyed that people don't take it more seriously. Mm-hmm. In the sense, and I may jab at people and things, and just because that's what I'll do, and I'll troll people a little bit. But when you actually get into the ideology, it's when you recognize, if you think libertarianism is a legitimate philosophy, like it's sort of like, then this is your thing. Like I don't see how you don't continue down this train of logic. And that's where I have kind of settled, is where philosophically I have very, very little issues. I mean, like I said, I fully agree. Zion is the goal and Zion is stateless. So I have the same end. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's actually very hard to find serious critiques of libertarianism. Yeah. I've looked for years and years to find, but they're mostly straw man arguments and other things. Because what I've come to realize, and I've told you this before, kind of tongue in cheek, but it's true, to take libertarianism seriously, you end up joining it. That's why it's so hard to find serious critics of libertarianism. And it's similar with the church. I had a Catholic friend ask me, they're like, how come no serious Bible scholars
talk about the Book of Mormon. And I'm like, well, a few have, and they ended up joining the church. So,
well, I definitely think that regardless of where one falls in it, and again, I think it's more branding problem than anything is it. I think libertarianism is actually growing in its kind of vogue amongst younger conservative types, because I think it is more philosophically rigorous in a lot of ways, and ultimately, at least for me, there is this innate idea about liberty, and within a religious context, it comes from the idea of agency, and there's an inherent conflict when you understand what the state is. And I think that's the biggest thing that people don't understand. In fact, I'm planning on making a video on the state, on this idea of the state, because people think the state is this wonderful provider of goodness and wonder, and it's like, you are wrong. You're so wrong, and you've been fooled. And once that's understood, once you understand the problem with the state, which is very, very foreign for people, it takes a lot for them to kind of make that thing. Like I said, I actually discovered that when I was fairly young with that quote that my dad told me. And that kind of started me on this journey of thinking like this. But my main critiques, and this is kind of something that I want to go over later, so this would be just kind of a preview. They're not so much philosophical as they are practical. And I think that within the libertarian movement itself, there's a lot of conversation about practicalities. Like you said, there's a lot of different groups who have different ideas about that. So I end up finding that I'm on that side of the spectrum. And I think a lot more people are, or at least they will be, or they should be, if they can come to a proper understanding of some of the basic philosophical foundations of it. But anyway, any other thoughts before we wrap this up?
Man, there's just so much that I could say. So we better wrap it up. It's late. It's my bedtime.
We could go forever. Well, hey, Morgan, I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for a while. We'll have to do it again sometime. We can talk about maybe some of my trepidation into being fully baptized into the waters of the anarchist societies. But it's been fun, man. So thanks for taking the time, and we'll talk again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. I'll see you around, buddy.
See ya.
Take care.